Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Mike Dobbs. I'm the managing editor for Reminder Publications. And tonight, we've got a pleasure and a privilege to talk to Charlie Ryan, the former mayor of Springfield. We're going to be talking to Mayor Ryan about his long career in public service. And by the way, I should point out some trivia to you, Charlie. You may not be aware of this. You are the only mayor in the city's history to serve in 2 different centuries.
No, I never thought.
That's right.
I didn't realize that.
So Mayor Ryan was mayor at 2 very important times in the city's history. During his first administration, he dealt with issues such as racial unrest and the civil rights movement in the city, as well as the federal government's decision to close the Springfield Armory. And of course, the Springfield Armory was the reason we have this city here, practically. He also had a very significant role after he left office in reshaping the downtown. Now, during his second administration, Mayor Ryan had to work with state officials to solve the city's financial crisis, a situation he inherited from the previous administration. His work with the Finance Control Board preserved much of the local decision-making power as possible, while at the same time, he satisfied state officials with his financial responsibility and reform. Charlie, thanks for talking with us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mike. Yeah.
I've got to ask you first, we'll start at the beginning.
Go ahead.
Why did you get into politics in the first place? You were a young attorney with a young family. What motivated you to run for mayor?
Well, I kind of grew up in a house where politics was talked about. My father, who was a great guy and kind of a real role model for me, I loved him very much and benefited from all the things he taught me. My father, as a young man, and they were around 30-odd years of age, was elected and served for several years as the chairman of the Democratic City Committee. And that would have been back in the early 1930s. The Depression started in 29. 1930, and all the 30s were really pretty tough times here, whether in Springfield or any place in the United States. And he was the head of the Democratic Party at a time when the Republicans pretty much controlled the city government and the state government here in Massachusetts. Much different now, as we all know, and has been different for quite a long time. So anyway, I was used to that. And then when John Kennedy became congressman right after World War II, as you remember, he'd been injured in the war. His small Navy craft was shot down in the Pacific, and it's lucky he wasn't killed then. But he came back and healed reasonably well, and then became a new congressman in one of the Boston districts, and then ultimately graduated and ran against kind of a legendary figure, Henry Cabot Lodge, in the federal Senate, and then ultimately ran for president in 1960 and was elected in a very, very close race over Richard Nixon. And I can remember taking the day off from work, and I was a young lawyer at the time. I passed the bar and was sworn in November of 1951. And by the time we're talking about early 1961, when John Kennedy was sworn in, I was into my career about 10 years, and naturally, Kennedy was a big figure for everybody, especially people from his own state. And so I took the the time of that day off from work to watch his inaugural address. And, you know, people don't believe that these kind of things can happen. But as I sat there with my father and my brothers and watched this, it was a big, big deal. And he looked into the camera and said, "Don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And, you know, I had never really thought of it that way. Very simple, not very complicated to understand the little twist he put on his words. But if you want to know how it happened and when it happened, that really started it. And the more I thought of it and what he represented, because he was young, he followed Dwight Eisenhower, who was a great hero in World War II. But he was young and youthful and attractive, and his whole address was exciting. And so to think of, you know, this is where we're going to go, and it kept eating at me and eating at me, and then all of a sudden, you know, other people began. I had been asked to serve in 1959 politically by a fellow named Larry O'Brien, who was a close friend of Jack Kennedy's, who was from Springfield.
Let me just interrupt you to tell people that Larry O'Brien
Yeah.
was the Postmaster General under President Kennedy.
Yes.
Was the leader of the chair of the Democratic Party at one point, and then wound up being the commissioner of the National Basketball Association.
Yeah, that's
with
right.
close ties to the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
He was
tell
an
people
integral
that.
part of JFK's administration in the short time that Kennedy was there. And then he continued on with President Johnson for another 2 or 3 years. And he not only, Postmaster General was the slot he had, and that's what paid his paycheck, but he really was the #1 guy in both of those administrations that did the arm twisting and the vote counting from a political point of view as to how they were doing on certain issues that were before the Congress. So he was kind of the top political guy. And as I say, we're sitting right now about the length of a football field from where Larry worked across Main Street. And he was a great guy. And he had been asked a year or so earlier by some of the leaders of the city on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, to lead a movement for a new Plan A charter, which would give a strong mayor and a weak council, rather than what we had at that time was a strong council and a weak mayor. So it was to reverse it on the idea that the city could do better. And he had asked me some months earlier to be a member of that committee. Would I serve with him? And I said yes. And then he called me at Christmas time, right after Christmas, and said that he had been down at Palm Beach with Jack Kennedy for a long weekend with kind of all of their inner circle people, making plans for the Democratic convention, which was going to be held in Los Angeles later that year, 1960. So he said, I'm not going to be able to do that Plan A thing. And I was wondering if you would be willing to take my place. So I said, well, okay, let me think about it. I'll call you back. And I called him back a day or two later, and I said, I think it'd be fun. So it was fun, and the opposition was really the then city council.
Sure.
Because they were going to lose a lot of their power, and so I had the job of trying to mobilize a force against them politically, and we did very well, and we won that election by a 3-to-1 margin, and so then inevitably, you know, people would begin to think of me in a political way rather than as a lawyer, as a young lawyer. So anyway, so ultimately that morphed into a situation where then people did start talking about me, and by sometime in 1961, I had made up my mind and was on out campaigning and ultimately successful.
The mayor at that time was a gentleman named Tommy O'Connor.
Tommy
Thomas
O'Connor, yeah.
And again, for our viewers who may not remember him, you've heard of the TJO Center, the Thomas O'Connor Animal Center here in Springfield. That was something that he advocated for when he was a Hampden County Commissioner many, many years later after being mayor. But he was mayor at the time, and he was sort of a rising star in the Democratic Party.
Very much so.
And at the time, I think we talked about this yesterday, just prior to the mayoral election, he had been involved with a race for the Senate, for the U.S. Senate.
U.S. Senate, yes.
And I know people might find this hard to believe, but a guy from Springfield actually was the nominee for the Democratic Party to run for Senate.
And Tommy was a young man at that time. He and I were both about the same age, but I would say when he ran for the U.S. Senate in 1960,
It would have been 60? Yeah.
1960, he was probably 37, 38. I would have been 33 or 34.
You were the kid.
Well, we were both kids.
Didn't people say you were too young to be mayor?
And then when I ran 10 years ago, they said I was too old to be mayor. Next time I'm going to come back and do it when I'm 50.
So what was the prime issue in that mayor's race between you and Mr. O'Connor? What were the things that people really were talking about?
One thing is he had been surprisingly successful in his race to become the Democratic nominee for senator. And to do that, he had to beat our incumbent governor, Foster Ferkalow, who was from around here, but had served as governor for at least 2 terms, and would hope to go. He was a former congressman, then he became state treasurer, then he became governor of Massachusetts, but to everybody's surprise, Tommy O'Connor beat Foster Ferkalow, and therefore had the privilege of running against Liverett Saltonstall for the Senate seat that Saltonstall had been occupying for the previous 10, 15, or 20 years. And unfortunately for Tom, he did not make it. He lost. And so his hopes for that kind of a career were dashed, and he had to come back to Springfield and pick up where he left off. But in the meantime, things had gotten kind of sour because of a change in the, not a change in the law, but a decision of our Massachusetts Supreme Court that said that the assessors of Springfield were illegally valuing homes, our people where we all live, to give a break to homeowners at the expense of the business community. And so they ordered all of the then current bills to be thrown out, and that new bills had to be made up immediately, reflecting the law as stated by the Supreme Court. So that brought about chaos. Nobody knew what they had. All they knew was that they figured that their bills were going to go, and nobody could sell a house or think about selling a house because nobody knew where it was going to be 6 months from now as to how much of a tax you're going to have. And the homeowner's tax, the property tax, really is kind of the key tax that supports our local government. And so it had everybody's attention, and he had to deal with that. And that was a difficult political thing for him to have to do.
So when he came back after his campaign,
Right.
now he was facing a major, major tax issue.
Right.
And that was part of the whole issues within the mayoral campaign with you.
That's right. Yep.
Now, so when you took office, which would have been January of 1962,
That's right.
how would you describe Springfield at that point? You know, you know me, I love local history, and
Yeah.
I've always thought of Springfield as a manufacturing hub
Right.
for the Northeast.
Yeah.
We had so much going on.
Yeah.
Down the street was Milton Bradley. Up State Street, we had, well, in 1962 they were gone, but in the 50s, we still had the Indian Motorcycle there. We had the Armory. We had all sorts of things going on. So in 1962, how would you describe Springfield at that point? Was it still strong in terms of being a manufacturing community?
Well, no, what was happening in Springfield was really what was happening at least throughout New England. And we were in the middle of a period which had started before 1962, maybe 15, 20 years before, but was doing a lot of damage to us in the process. And that was the decision by the owners of the textile companies to go to the South, where there was less union activity, where the business owners felt they could make more money with less government intrusion and regulations. And so there was an exodus that was already in process. And that continued on and until really it's been many, 2 or 3 generations since the textiles have left our area. And along with it, kind of what was left in manufacturing. I can remember not only in the campaign of 1961, but also in the other 2 campaigns, because I served for 3 terms at that time, so I had to be elected on 3 different occasions. And of course, it wasn't O'Connor in the 2nd and 3rd, but the campaigning at that time was totally different than what it is today, that you would always be getting up early in the dark because you had to go to plant gates, that the votes were at the plant gates, that it was primarily men, but some women, going to work at 5 o'clock, 5:30, 5:45, 6 o'clock at American Bosch and Van Norman and other businesses in Indian Orchard, out Boston Road, and that's
down the street.
Who's this?
American Bosch just down the street too.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
North Main Street. It's a big parking lot. Right? I think that's where the employees of Bay State Medical now park their cars. You know, probably 1,000 cars there. That used to have 3,000 or 4,000 workers, and doing top-notch, high skill work. They were highly thought of, and those were beautiful jobs. And so you had that was something that wasn't just Springfield. That was our region, and so it was suffering. And the most stable one, the one that we were counting on to stay, was of course the Springfield Armory, which had been here since George Washington put it here. If you talk of, I mean, that's almost, it's hard to believe. But George Washington made a special trip up the Connecticut River, and when he found that when you got to Enfield, there was a lot of rapids there, so it would be difficult to bring boats up the river to attack an arsenal. That's where he wanted to be. He wanted the protection of the arsenal, because travel 200-odd years ago was virtually by boat. There wasn't any good highways to speak of. And so George Washington planted it here, and we had it here as a federal arsenal until 1964. It took a year or 2 to fight that when the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, then ruled it out.
I think a lot of people may not understand the role the Armory played, because the Armory was a manufacturing center.
Right.
And an innovation center for
Right.
machining and engineering.
Yes.
It helped create a labor pool here, and that trained labor pool was then used by everybody, by Smith & Wesson,
Yes.
by Indian Motorcycle, by American Bosch. So I think people sometimes forget that without the Armory here, who knows what Springfield would have been as a community.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, without the Armory here, I probably never would have been I wouldn't have been here, because my great-grandfather, Philip Ryan, came from Ireland at the time of the potato famine in early 1850, and he went to Rockville, Connecticut, near Vernon, and he met a woman there, Mary McGuire, who was about his age, who also had come from Ireland because there was no jobs, and 1 million or 2 million people were starving because of the famine. And they got married, and then after getting jobs in the mill down there, he heard about the Springfield Armory. So he said to his wife that he'd like to go up and check out and see if there's any jobs at the Springfield Armory. He came up, he got a job at the Springfield Armory in, let's say, 1852 or 3, so far as we can tell. And we've been here ever since. And
that's one thing the Armory did. It provided these jobs.
it was the center of that kind of activity. And you know, it's like people like to cluster and for whatever reason. And so as the Industrial Revolution continued, and there was going to be more and more places where there were machines that fabricated something, then Springfield was a place to be, because they had Big Daddy down at the Armory with all the skills that were inherent in that place. And so the Springfield Armory had an enormous impact on the course that Springfield as a community took. And it was a devastating blow when you know, Washington came here, let's say in 1780 or so, and then by 1970, it was gone. Its mission was gone. The buildings were still there.
So you're mayor of Springfield.
Yeah.
How did you find out that this was even being proposed to eliminate the Armory, which was a key research and development place, as well as manufacturing for the American military? How did you find out as mayor?
Oh, I think I got a call. My memory is I got a call that morning from Ted Kennedy, who was a senator at that time, saying, "I got bad news for you." And, you know, oh my God. And then Eddie Boland was the congressman, and he called and we talked, and so we said, well, you know, let's see where we're going and find out whether or not there's any hope of turning this around. And within, I would say within 10 days, I had been visited repeatedly by senior technical officials at the Armory, giving their story and saying that that McNamara had made a tragic mistake, that the Armory should not be closed. The Armory was doing a great job, and they began to give me facts and figures that supported that. And so that process of learning as much as we could about the Armory and whether or not a case could be built for it continued at least another month or so, to make sure that we really understood the thing, but we did, and so we had a great effort and ended up fighting it for close to 2 years before McNamara rang down the curtain on our efforts.
Now, Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense at that time.
Yes.
So this was the Lyndon Johnson administration. No, it was the Kennedy administration.
It was Lyndon Johnson at the time this happened.
All right. Did he ever?
McNamara had been appointed first by
Kennedy.
John Kennedy. Yes.
Did he ever come to Springfield to see the Armory?
Oh yes, and we went to his office, and I don't know whether or not the people who are watching us remember it's not that long ago when George Bush, kind of came a cropper in Iraq, and it didn't work out the way that his people said it was going to work out. And his most ardent apostle of going into Iraq and handling it the way they did was Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld, yeah, Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah. And he reminded me so much of McNamara in that they were both very, very bright, very opinionated, very arrogant. They considered at all occasions that each one of them was the smartest guy in the room, smartest guy in that particular city. There was nobody smarter in Rumsfeld's opinion than himself, and there certainly was nobody smarter than Robert McNamara. And so he was able to convince John Kennedy, and Kennedy did what McNamara said, and so did Lyndon Johnson. So for a period of almost 6 years, he really was calling the shots. And the Vietnam War, which really was catastrophic for our nation and for especially the young men of that era, that it was the wrong call for a lot of reasons, but nobody could tell McNamara different until it was all over, and we had long since had to flee from rooftops in Saigon as we evacuated Vietnam, that he finally acknowledged that, gee whiz, this was a mistake. Well, God, I almost threw up because I've always cared about what happens in our government, and this was devastating, and this guy, there was no such thing as dialogue, there was no such thing as compromise, there was no such thing as another point of view, and it was a disaster. And then when you look again, 20-odd years after that, with Rumsfeld and poor George Bush, who I don't think ever really understood where he was. Again, all the harm. I mean, today's foolishness, not foolishness, tragedies, ISIS and everything. This is just a natural follow-on that, you can't make mistakes like that and be so darn doctrinaire. But these have been two mortal wounds to our country, and obviously the men who not only paid the sacrifice of their lives, or had their lives ruined and lived the rest of their years in hospitals or grievous pain.
Well, I know that this area has long depended on the American military as part of being its economic development engine with Westover Air Force Base, with the Armory.
Yeah.
And I think you told me the other day there was some 3,000 jobs at the Armory that were eliminated because of this, and these were highly trained, highly proficient machinists and researchers.
We were, Mike, when we finally got our act together after doing our analysis and felt we had an enormously strong case. We then asked for a meeting with Secretary McNamara, and that was achieved. And so it was going to be held in his office in the Pentagon. And the senators were going to be a part of that. Not that they were going to really do the homework. That was going to be done by us here and the technological guys at the Armory. And Governor Volpe was a part of it, Congressman Boland, Congressman Conti. And we went down there and we had, oh, I'd say it was probably a 2 or 3 hour presentation on a morning. And it was held in his office, which was in a very expansive. And then, like all these things, you have a break from time to time, a little coffee or whatever. And so I was standing with him, you know, we'd got to know each other. And he has a credenza there. And I said to him, you know, Secretary, I don't understand your thinking. The Springfield Armory is the center of the United States government's small arms weaponry. That's everything from pistols up to howitzers, you know, which are big, you know, fill this room. And this is going to be a small arms war, not a nuclear war. It's not, you know, a rocket war. It's a small arms war. Why at a time like this? It's not just what we make there. It's the fact that the brains of our small arm approach is there.
Right.
They are the cop on the beat. That when we have private industry do it, they have to watch out for the cop. Well, the cop is Springfield. And, you know, if you get rid of the cop, there's nobody in control. And I says, I know the small arms people want that to be, but I says, we need it. And so he said to me, Mayor Ryan, he said, and he takes me over to this credenza, and there's a rifle there. What's the German, the Russian rifle?
The Velishnikov?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And he said, you see that? He said, that was taken from a Viet Cong. He said, that's a piece of crap. He says, for crying out loud, we can beat these guys anytime we want. Well, this was 1965. And by 1968, it was clear that they couldn't beat them anytime they want, and they knew it or should have known it at that time, but it was still more braggadocio and more troops. You know, we can beat these guys anytime we want. So that's the path we went down. And this is the guy who 2 presidents in a row felt he really is smarter than me, therefore I should be paying attention to what he said. So he had carte blanche. And it was tragic. And a great mistake was made.
Well, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk about how you, among other people, helped build out of the ashes Springfield Technical Community College.
Okay, fine.
We'll be right back, folks.
Yep.